Hello, this is Alexis May for AI Med, and today I'm delighted to be joined by two special guests, Mike Fisher and Guy Wood-Gush. Could I perhaps start by asking you both to introduce yourselves, please? Guy, let's start with you.
Thank you, Alexis. I'm Guy Wood-Gush. I'm Chief Executive of Deontics. My background is in clinical medicine. So I was originally a junior doctor in the hospital setting. And then left, and since then I've worked in pharmaceuticals and drug development, and most of the time in healthcare investment banking, and then latterly as an entrepreneur in digital health. And me and the other members of the other founders of the Deontics team spun Deontics out from Oxford University Cancer Research UK and University College London in 2014.
Thanks, Guy. Great to have you here. And Mike, a little bit of an introduction.
Happy to do. I'm Mike Fisher. I'm a clinical interventional cardiologist at the Liverpool University Hospitals Foundation Trust. I'm also the Chief Clinical Information Officer there, with a long-standing interest in IT and healthcare and innovation. The Royal Liverpool part of the trust was one of the global digital exemplar sites, and through that we came to meet up with Guy and have had a collaboration which has been going on for over a couple of years now, I think.
Okay, thank you both so much for being here. As you know, a big focus for AI Med is around the successful deployment of AI solutions in healthcare. And I'm delighted to say that you have a story to share around that. Guy, perhaps you could start by providing a little bit of background, of how this came around.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, maybe I should just say a few words about the Deontics platform. So, this is a highly sophisticated point-of-care dynamic clinical decision support system. We liken it to a clinical sat-nav in that it reacts instantaneously to changes in patient data. Basically, it's got three components. The main component that underpins the whole thing is a universally applicable digital clinical logic model. And then the second component is an authoring tool or an encoding tool, which can encode clinical guidelines such as NICE guidelines, local protocols. System is agnostic as to what the content is, and it will encode them into the standardized digital logic model. And then the third element is the decision engine, which dynamically integrates individual patient data with the encoded logic, and through that process delivers highly granular, personalized, evidence-based treatment recommendations at the point of care. So what we're doing at Liverpool and working with Mike is developing different pathways for deployment in different areas of the hospital, but we started with deployment of an acute coronary syndrome pathway in the acute coronary care unit. And now we're moving on. The second thing we've done, and of course in the recent past, is a COVID treatment pathway, and we're moving on now to look at other pathways, which will probably include taking the ACS into A&E and into the rest of the hospital, and probably also a suite of cardiology pathways in outpatients. And there may be other pathways that we will look at, but that's where we are at the moment.
Thanks, Guy, for sharing that. And Mike, you mentioned you've been working together for a couple of years now. From the trust point of view, what's your experience been over that period of time?
Well, the issue for us was that we were very interested in trying to develop decision support within the trust, and that was particularly part of the GDE program. However, medicine is full of decision support tools and has been for a very long time. They're called clinical guidelines. And the problem is that although we all have lots and lots of clinical guidelines, they tend to be very inconsistently used by clinicians. And there are a variety of reasons for that, some of which are cultural and some of which are practical. But what we wanted to do was to find a way of using digital technology to try and break down some of those barriers. Now, the initial project that we went with was, as Guy mentioned, the chest pain pathway. And there's lots of good guidance on this. The NICE, the body that writes clinical guidelines for national consumption, has written several statements on how to best manage chest pain. And despite that, although once the patient gets to cardiology, on the whole, those guidelines tend to be reasonably well followed. They're not so well followed in the A&E departments, and that's partially down to business and partially due to just lack of knowledge, really. But there are some very practical consequences of that, because one problem is that it tends to result quite frequently in over-treatment inappropriately of people. And the other problem that it results in is the fact that there are many individuals who, if guidance were followed, could actually go home, who end up being referred to cardiology unnecessarily and consequently have their in-hospital stay prolonged, which isn't good for anybody, and in particular circumstances, particularly is undesirable. So we formed the association with Deontics to try and help with that. Deontics have been really good in terms of being responsive and helping us to develop that pathway, because although, as Guy mentioned, they have the main components of their engine were already created, and authoring the actual details of the pathway wasn't a problem. I think but for reasons that perhaps we should talk about in a minute, they did an awful lot of work in integrating their product into our existing EPR. And I think that was incredibly important in terms of usability.
Okay, that's a really interesting point that I think we can dig into, Mike, in part 2 of this AI Med talk. We will leave it here. We've set a nice context out to follow up in the next session. Thank you both for joining me for now, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And you can check out more AI Med talks at www.ai-med.io.